Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about NFTs on Arweave. So let me just share my screen. Okay. Jesse, can you see and hear me? Okay, I can't hear you other than in the other room, but I'm sure it's fine. All right, perfect. So yes, NFTs are a big use case of the Arweave network that have evolved over the last year, I would say. There was very little awareness in the NFT community a year ago, but now we find that almost all new platforms using Arweave and many of the old platforms are also moving to use Arweave in the future. And the reason for that is pretty simple. But today, the talk will actually be split into two different sections, where we'll talk first about why you should use Arweave for NFT storage, and how, and actually like go into some code to do it. It's extremely simple, so this really doesn't take very long. And the second half, I thought we would explore something a little more, would you say, experimental. It's the idea of liquid NFTs. So solving one of the big problems in the NFT space, which is that all of the assets are essentially illiquid or have very low liquidity and subsequently market efficiency relative to assets such as fungible tokens that we're sort of used to trading. And we think that there's an obvious solution to that using Radicle Markets, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. But first, in case we're completely new to the space, NFTs, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the contracts are immutable and that the storage at least used to be mutable. So when you would issue an NFT on top of Ethereum, you have to point to using an ERC 721 or other format. You would have to point to a contract, point to a metadata file, which has to be stored somewhere, which is accessible. And the standard doesn't really specify where that metadata should go, just that it should be stored somewhere and it should be a URL that you can access. And the problem with this, of course, is that that URL cannot be changed after you mint the NFT. It will always remain the same. And this is a fundamental issue because the structure of the web, the 1.0, at least the HTTP web, is that addresses can change. They point to data that is stored somewhere, but realistically, the address is likely going to have to shift in the future. So whether it's an IP address or a domain name, at some point, those resources will likely have to change. And when they do, you won't be able to update the contract to point to the new location of the metadata, and subsequently the metadata points in a sort of chain to the typically file, so like an art asset, like an image or a video. And when this happens, you're fundamentally screwed. Ultimately, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't go back and change them later. Arguably, it will likely make the value of the asset almost zero. So this is a huge problem. And in the first wave of NFTs, almost every contract suffered from this issue. Then came along a sort of old solution, which was, okay, so we can just store a hash of the file or the metadata in the contract, and then at least we'll be able to find or verify that we have the right data later if it still exists. And so people used SHA-256 hashes to begin with. We saw some, as well as IPFS hashes. So IPFS is, for those that aren't aware, it's a file system, basically. It'll allow you to find a piece of data if a piece of data is in a system, in the network somewhere. But it doesn't do anything about storage, doesn't persist or replicate data. It just sort of allows you to find it if it's there. And so, of course, in the first wave, there was this idea that, okay, we're going to store these hashes into the contracts, and then someone somewhere is going to have to pin the data. But in reality, and by pinning, we really just mean kind of expose it publicly continually. In reality, what we found happened was a huge number of these hashes went missing. And so while if anyone were to ever find the old metadata files or the assets that went with them, we could reconcile them, if you will. We could make them public again and verifiable again. But if we can't find them, they're over. It's gone. So the new solution that really sort of took hold earlier this year, but there was sort of you'd say that the early users started about a year ago, is to use permanent storage. So that's storage where there's a sustainable endowment structure which produces interest, which is used to pay for storage over time, so that you can be confident that the data will never go missing. This obviously finds its natural home on Arweave, and we see a huge number of people taking this up now, from OpenSea, who have integrated it, all the way through to, I think, when Tim Berners-Lee wanted to issue the NFT version of the source code of Web 1.0, basically is actually the HTTP server, as well as the first HTTP client. He stored it on Arweave with a hash in the contract, as well as, I think, Jay-Z and a whole bunch of famous people now. Of course, BT from the electronic music scene. Really very large number of artists have taken this up, and we see that almost all new platforms are doing this, because we are biased. However, it does seem to us, at least, like this is the natural and obvious solution to the problem. Okay, so that's probably why you should do it. The next question is, of course, how? Well, the first is super, super easy. It's Arweave+IPFS as a bridge. So in the Arweave network, there are nodes that run an optional extension that exposes the data that they're replicating locally in the IPFS network. So you can essentially take an IPFS hash from the IPFS net and then put it in a piece of data or a transaction on Arweave, send that to the network, so pay for it, and then those nodes will optionally, and unfortunately at this point, would you say voluntarily, pick them up and expose them in IPFS. And this solves the issue somewhat. Of course, there is this problem that they're not enforced to do this. You require some number of people to do it voluntarily. Although, unfortunately, this is sort of naturally the case with all IPFS gateways. So it's the same with like a Filecoin IPFS gateway, and also, I believe, Pinata. Like you can't enforce in IPFS that someone, exposes a piece of data, or at least not very easily. Like we've been theorizing about some methods you could use to do it, but no one's launched one in production that's sort of coherent and strong. So it's got some downsides, but it is actually extraordinarily easy, like really profoundly easy. If you're already doing this, or you already potentially have a whole bunch of IPFS hashes that you want to replicate onto the Arweave network, just post to ipfs.arweave.com, which is a IPFS Arweave gateway, basically. Post/permapin and your IPFS hash, and then it will go for you and it'll grab the data from IPFS if it's available, and then it'll put it in an Arweave transaction, send it to the network, and then those bridge nodes, which are there in a network of 10 or so at the moment, will pick it up, or at least that I'm aware of, will pick it up and they will expose it permanently pinned inside IPFS. So you can get back to that IPFS hash now from actually any client. That's the idea, at least. So this works pretty well. Of course, there's a problem that the gateways aren't incentivized and really can never properly be with IPFS, but that's sort of what you get with the protocol, the file system protocol. Another method is to use Arweave.js or similar. This is also extremely easy. It's just a few lines of code this time. The process is essentially the same whether you're using JavaScript or Go or Java or PHP, you name it. Pretty much every language has an Arweave library at this point. But basically, you just want to load the library into your environment wherever you're creating your NFT. You want to create an Arweave transaction, and you want to set the data to be whatever the data should be, according to the image or what have you, potentially metadata as well. So then you would want to create two transactions, and you just sign the transaction. And then there's also a post as well. It's just await Arweave transactions.post. And then it's very simple. This will get the data into the network for you, and it will give you a transaction ID. So in the transaction variable there, if you just say transaction.id, it will give you the identifier that you can use to refer to it later. So then you just embed this transaction ID into your Ethereum NFT contract, for example. So one interesting thing people are debating at the moment is whether to refer to these external resources essentially to the Ethereum contract by a gateway. So via HTTP and a gateway address stroke the transaction ID in the case of Arweave, or whether to say AR:// and then a identifier. And this is interesting because it's really it's a judgment call. So the plus side of AR:// is that it's sort of clear to any client that is viewing it what the data is, and so that's somewhat helpful. And it means that you can pick it up easily and say, oh, okay, AR:// means that I need to somehow get this piece of data from Arweave. Typically, you'll append or add the transaction ID as a suffix to the address of a gateway. So Arweave.net stroke, and then your transaction ID in order to get back the piece of data. But it could be any other gateway, and it's easy to pick up. That's the benefit on one side. The benefit on the other side of, for example, just saying HTTPS : Arweave.net or any other gateway address stroke the transaction ID is that actually all ERC 721 or what have you clients will be able to pick up that format and say, oh, okay, I know what that is. That's a link. I'm going to go resolve it, and they'll get the data back and they'll continue working. You essentially don't need any code in order to have an integration. So the benefit there is that it's sort of more interoperable. The downside is, of course, when that gateway goes down, and Arweave.net is not meant to be permanent. It's a typical Web 2 service to some extent. It's a gateway to the PermaWeb. It's not part of the PermaWeb. When that gateway goes down, then you're going to have to be able to pick out all of the gateways that people have been using and replace them one by one with the new gateway address, or potentially even just directly accessing the data from Arweave. Oh, my Apple ID is being used to sign into a new device. I'm going to not allow that. I can do that later. That's helpful. Wow, what more can go wrong today? Okay, so yes, you've got to decide basically whether you want to embed the gateway address and have people change it out at the say no. Okay. Yes. Whether to change it out or to just have AR:// and then insert it at the appropriate time. AR:// is making its way through the sort of adoption process. It's already in OpenSea. So if they see that address, they'll replace it with an Arweave gateway address. But there are many other clients, frankly, that haven't picked it up yet. So that'll be a bit of a process. All right. Now we can't click. Excellent. So that's a little bit about Arweave and using it essentially as a storage layer for NFTs. It's super, super simple. There isn't really much more to say about it. I guess one thing that you might be interested in is that there's an Arweave Boost program, we call it, where basically we can give you some tokens which you can use to store NFTs onto the PermaWeb. So just ping Seb or Jesse about getting hold of some of those if you need some tokens for storage. We're happy to, within reason, subsidize that. But I think that there's more interesting things we can talk about potentially for the future. And one of those is liquid NFTs. So the problem that liquid NFTs are addressing is that NFT markets are highly inefficient. That is, you buy a NFT one day, and someone might send some bids your way that you're going to get this email from OpenSea or what have you about, and there's no live market for it. You might eventually accept one of those bids, or you place it with a price, but ultimately it's a sort of not quite barter system, but pretty close in order to get a price for your NFT. There might well just simply not be a market for people buying your NFT at all. You may buy an NFT. I think I've done this before. Not very exciting NFTs. I don't think anyone will ever want to buy those again. So I can put the price to whatever I want it to be, but basically no one's going to be interested in purchasing it from me. In terms of market efficiency, the pricing system here is like hilariously bad. It's awfully inefficient. And this means that, yeah, your capital gets locked in something that may never get out of, or you may never be able to get out of at a fair price. And indeed, calculating what is or is not a fair price in the first place is just not easy. So a solution to that is NFT Radicle Markets. So a radical market is proposed by the book, actually, Radicle Markets. And essentially in this context, a user would stake tokens against NFTs, so against assets from a collection in the form of a community token. So if I wanted to get access to, I don't know, a Kevin Bosch 1111 NFT, I would first buy the 1111 community token, and then I would stake it against which one of the collection I wanted to own, and the tokens would be removed from the circulation. So there might be, I don't know, 100,000 tokens, and I would stake 1,000 of those tokens against one of the assets. And then someone else at any time could come along and they could outstake me. And they could say, actually, I think that this token is worth 100 or 1,200 tokens, or rather, this asset is worth 1,200 tokens. And then I would get my 1,000 tokens returned, and their 1,200 tokens would be staked into the asset. And what you have now is a collection where there's an associated token which gets more and more scarce the more people want to own the assets inside that collection. And then, of course, you can unstake those tokens at any time. And now you've got your tokens back into your wallet, but of course, someone else can come along and they can claim the asset. And once you have the token, you can sell it. And because there are lots and lots of different NFTs inside the collection, potentially hundreds of thousands even, if you do it as a platform-wide community token, the liquidity is much higher because someone that wants to stake against one asset over here is happy to buy the tokens from you that you were using to stake against an asset over here, right? So you don't have to have this situation where the person wanting to buy has to precisely, or the person wanting to sell has to precisely have something that another person is wanting to buy. You have essentially like a shared liquidity pool across a collection of NFTs. This is pretty powerful, we think, because it just gives you a liquid market for NFTs at any time. You can liquidate your entire collection if you want in one go, and there will always be someone there to buy it from you at a reasonable price. So another interesting component of this is that you can change the way that artists are rewarded as well. Instead of it being the case that artists just sell the NFT in the first instance, potentially, actually, presumably, and hopefully in some sense, below the true market price, yes, they can instead take 10%, for example, or some other percentage of each of the amounts of tokens that are staked against the asset over time. So, if I staked 1,000 tokens, then 900 of those would end up in the actual contract, and 100 of them would have gone to the artist. And then if someone else came along and they said, actually, 1,200 is a more appropriate value, then yes, they would come along and what I guess 120 tokens would go to the artist, and the rest would go into the contract. And so here, the artist accrues value from their work essentially indefinitely. And this is interesting because, of course, the general process with artists is that they don't start off at the peak of their career, right? Actually, you sell your early pieces and you lose access to the value of them, but later they might become more and more valuable. That isn't really very fair. What this gives artists is a way to gain income, more or less, from their assets, or from their creations indefinitely over time. And you can even, if you wanted to, turn that revenue stream basically into a profit-sharing token. So they own 100% of the royalties at the beginning, but then, of course, over time, they can sell that down if they so desire in a typical profit-sharing token system. And of course, you can also do this exact same maneuver with the platform itself. So the platform could take another 10% if it wanted to. And this could be how the platform and its token holders gain value as well. So this isn't just a theory. There's an example in practice, which is ArWiki. So if you go to arwiki.wiki, you'll find that it's essentially, as the name sort of implies, an Arweave wiki, where there's all sorts of information about the PermaWeb, and anyone can edit it, and it's a profit-sharing community. And as a user, you can stake tokens against an article in the ArWiki and have it, essentially be the sponsor for that period of time. And so this is a radical market. So the more people want to sponsor ArWiki articles, the more scarce the ArWiki token supply becomes, and subsequently, the higher the value of it would be. And of course, if you just want to invest then in the ArWiki, you just buy the token and you hold it, right? So now, as an investor, you can get access to the summation of the work inside an NFT collection in a much, much simpler way that's much, much more liquid than if you use a traditional NFT structure. So as far as I'm aware, ArWiki is the only instance of a liquid NFT platform in the wild. And that, I think, just leaves a huge amount of opportunity for people to come along and, and essentially, what would you say, gain the upside that's made by these, or by this mechanism. Yeah, so if you'd like to do that, we'd be very, very keen to invest. Actually, all of the tools that you would need are already available in the Arweave ecosystem. So there's community.xyz, the profit-sharing community platform, and all the rest of it. Yeah, and we'd really just love to speak to you about it and support you along the way. I think this could be a very, very cool way for people to have an alternate take on NFTs. You know, there's frankly like thousands probably of NFT platforms at this point. And there's lots of different niches within the NFT space. But having a sort of niche that's more about the mechanism itself and solving one of the fundamental problems, that is, you know, if I buy into this thing, how am I ever going to get my money back out? Could be super, super powerful. All right, so thank you everyone for joining. Let's now go to the chat space just out on the, I guess, left here and discuss. Thanks everyone for coming.